Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, June 7th, 2019. Well, I woke up to a flat tire, a dead battery, but I got all that squared away. And I have news for you with plenty of commentary. We begin with the efforts to fight what was called fake news, Russian meddling, brainwashing Americans through social media, and this has led to yesterday's big purge at YouTube. And while some nasty stuff has been deleted, there also is some good material from honorable people who has been, who've been tossed out. And there are no standards, there's no process, you can't appeal. It's arbitrary. And it becomes demagoguery at a certain stage. Earlier this year, Mint Press News and its impressive reporter, Whitney Webb, exposed NewsGuard, which is a corporate-backed effort to flag material on social media sites to try to give people guidance about what is credible and what isn't. And NewsGuard hasn't seemed to gain much traction. It's still out there. I see it occasionally on my Facebook feed. Now there is the Trust Project, and this is a doozy. It is centered around Pierre Omidyar, the guy who was an eBay investor, has a big ownership stake in PayPal. He funds The Intercept. He also funds a new program that Bill Kristol, the neocon who helped bring us the Iraq War and is now a never-Trumper. And I encourage you to read the lengthy piece, it's 22 pages printed out by Whitney Webb, and learn more about the Trust Project. And on the face of it, it's just top news companies who want to develop transparency standards to help consumers easily assess the quality and credibility of journalism. And it places trust indicators, a digital standard that meets people's needs. Now, this originates back in 2012 at the University of Santa Clara in Silicon Valley, where Mike Markkula, who was an original investor in Apple, has funded the Center for Applied Ethics. And Sally Lerman, who was working at the Markkula Center, is now the person who is running the Trust Project. It is funded by the Washington Post, The Economist, the Rothschild family, the Globe and Mail, owned by Canada's richest family, the Thompsons. They own Thomson Reuters. Also, the Financial Times, the BBC, USA Today, the New York Times, Hearst Television. These are corporate media operators. And don't forget the Wall Street Journal. That brings Murdoch into the picture. And so the Trust Project has 8 indicators that they use. And, of course, all the corporate media outlets pass with flying colors. They don't point out the way the New York Times and the Washington Post misled us on Russiagate, promoting a story using anonymous leaks, documents that we were not allowed to see. Yeah, a lot of trust involved in corporate media propaganda over the last few years. And Webb also points out that the trust indicators trigger the algorithms, and that determines what gets placed on page 1, what you see in a search result, and what you don't. And just the other day, in preparation for one of my local TV interviews here, I did a search on Bing, Google, and Yahoo. Neutral terms. It was news, GMO foods. And what was interesting, at Bing and at Google, the results came up, and then suddenly the page reloaded. And what I noticed was that sites that were critical of GMOs were pushed back to page 2, page 3. And organizations or articles that promote GMO products, or that declare them to be safe for consumers, or that declare them to be the solution to world hunger, those results were prominently displayed. Now, I'm going to have to go back and rerun that search and see if the Trust Project or even NewsGuard showed up as an indication of that manipulation. So Craig Newmark, the guy who killed newspapers with Craigslist, right? Newspapers were doing fine. Their classified ads were a huge source of revenue. Craigslist came along and took all that away. And I've met Newmark. I don't think he's an evil man. But he is helping fund this project. He's also working on media investments with a woman who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And, this woman, her name is Vivian Schiller. She's also a director of the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian, based in Britain. So this is a really great piece of reporting about a chilling development that people who listen to independent media outlets like the Peter B. Collins podcast, maybe you read Consortium News, Truth Out, Truth Dig, Shadowproof, Mint Press, we suffer from these programs because we are less visible. Now, the other linkage here that I think is critical is that Piero Midyar is funding the Trust Project, and he's also the main backer behind efforts of the Anti-Defamation League, the pro-Zionist gatekeepers, who I have had my own run-ins with when I was working in commercial radio here in San Francisco. I was assigned an ADL minder who would call my boss every time they felt I crossed some line because I was critical of the State of Israel and its policies. And the other last factor here that Webb discloses is the way Facebook and the other outlets are outsourcing their censorship as a way of trying to avoid responsibility for what appears on their platforms. And front page on Friday's New York Times, interesting exposure that most of the Democratic presidential candidates who were in San Francisco for the California State Democratic Party convention last weekend managed to squeeze in a lot of fundraisers aimed at the wealthy tech sector. And I'm not picking on anyone in particular here. Pete Buttigieg held 4 of them. Cory Booker was in Silicon Valley hitting the ATM. Kamala Harris, she was here. We had Gillibrand, Klobuchar. And these are many of the same people who then turn around and say they want to break up the tech industry. Now, I do not say that taking money from somebody automatically makes you beholden to them. But let's see who stands up, for example, for Claire Stapleton. She's the Googler who, along with another coworker, led the protests at Google over sexual harassment, over the use of binding arbitration for people who have employment disputes with Google. And while changes occurred because of Claire's leadership, she has resigned from Google. I made the choice after the heads of my department branded me with a kind of scarlet letter that makes it difficult to do my job or find another one. If I stayed, I didn't just worry that there'd be more public flogging, shunning, and stress. I expected it. And she says she was made an example of to send a message to others. You're going to compromise your career if you make the same choices that Claire made. It was designed to have a chilling effect on employees who raise issues or speak out. And Google, by the way, did an investigation. They found no evidence of retaliation. Maybe they should do a search. The New York Times has taken up the cause of freedom of the press and even invokes Julian Assange in a favorable way in a strong editorial here condemning the government of Australia for its twin raids earlier this week that we reported based on the correspondence from Joe Lauria, the Consortium News editor who has been in Australia this week. There were 2 raids, one against a reporter who had disclosed the surveillance plans of the Australian government. And then they hit the ABC, which is kind of the equivalent of PBS. It's Australia's public broadcaster. And they went in with warrants that permitted them not only to access and copy emails and other computer files, but to also delete them or to edit them. And that is a kind of Orwellian police state action that is truly alarming. Then on Wednesday, the cops went to ABC, and that's where they conducted the raid with those standards that I just cited. So the prime minister, the conservative guy who just got reelected, he said that the investigations are being conducted independently of his government, but he said it never troubles me that our laws are being upheld. And the Times says the trouble is that Australia has been steadily expanding its range of national security laws, including a requirement that telecommunications companies retain all metadata for 2 years. And since 2015, journalists have been advised not to use cell phones to communicate with sources there. And then they cite Assange, saying, whatever the reason for the timing of these raids, they contribute to the sense of the news media being under broad attack on Western fronts led by Trump's relentless campaign against the press. The United States government last month charged Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, with violating the Espionage Act in publishing classified military and diplomatic documents, a blow aimed directly at the heart of the First Amendment. The Times is seeing its ox prepared for goring. Is that a verb? I think so. A report from CBS News, based on an interview with British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. He, of course, is vying to replace Theresa May as the leader of the Conservative Party and the next Prime Minister of Britain. And he says he would have no problem signing the papers to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. Well, we would have to follow our own legal processes, just as the U.S. has to follow its own legal processes. But I would want to stand in the way. Would I want to stand in the way of Julian Assange facing justice? No, I would not. And a further quote, Julian Assange is someone who is alleged to have committed some very serious crimes, alleged to have led to people's deaths. Do you know that's not true? People have very carefully studied all of the releases of WikiLeaks and concluded that to date, not a single person has died as a result of exposure by WikiLeaks. And I have some problems with the standards that Julian Assange has used at times. He's been too freewheeling and allowed sensitive information that could lead to people getting killed to be released. But it hasn't happened. And Jeremy Hunt does not know what he's talking about. Russia, feeling squeezed out of the authoritarian crackdown on the press, staged a takedown of a journalist yesterday. They claimed that he had bath salts, you know, that drug that makes people take their clothes off and do weird stuff. The guy's name is Ivan Golanov. They arrested him, beat him while in their custody, and claimed that they had found mephedrone, also known as bath salts, on his person. He then demanded that they take tests of his fingers and his clothing to find traces of that. The cops refused. Then they dragged him across the floor while in custody. At least one of the cops punched him in the face and kicked him in the chest. Our bluffer-in-chief is flying back. Maybe he's already back in Washington by now. But on the way, he tweeted a shift in his position toward Mexico. Quote, if we're able to make the deal with Mexico, and there's a good chance that we will, they will begin purchasing farm and agricultural products at very high levels starting immediately. If we are unable to make the deal, Mexico will begin paying tariffs at the 5% level on Monday. Huh? I thought the threat was about immigrants and about sealing the border. An impossible task, but one that Trump wants Mexico to take up. And in its polite detached way, the Washington Post says, it was not clear why Trump was suddenly tying the tariffs to trade issues rather than Mexico's ability to halt illegal immigration to the U.S., which is what he said last week when he first leveled the threat. Now, with Trump, it's risky to make predictions, especially on a Friday with tariffs that are supposed to go into effect on Monday. But if I had to bet, I would bet that he is going to blink, and he will find a face-saving way to say, oh, Mexico's coming around, so I'll put it off for a month. That's one of his favorite gambits. And he'll say, we'll see. But the effort to change asylum processes, what they are calling the third country rule, or the first country rule, I don't know, this is crazy. If you are from Guatemala, you go to Mexico and request asylum in the United States and stay in Mexico. If you're in Honduras or El Salvador, you go to the dangerous neighboring country, Guatemala, apply for asylum in the U.S. and wait there. Now, none of the coverage raises the issue of this is not compliant with U.S. law. And Trump can't just arbitrarily change the asylum procedures and standards, even if Mexico agrees. Am I the only one raising that issue? Seems like it. More cruelty in our immigration crackdown. A Vietnamese immigrant, now a legal U.S. resident in San Jose, California, is near death. He needs a bone marrow transplant. And he has two brothers in Vietnam who applied for B-2 tourist visas at the end of May, citing a medical emergency, and they've been turned down. Their brother can just die. We're also learning that an inspector general for Homeland Security has visited some of the grisly immigrant lockups, like the one that we have profiled before in Adelanto, California. And they find rotting food, moldy and dilapidated bathrooms, practices that violate the rights, the human rights of the individuals. And that's hardly a surprise. But there's no outrage. It's just, well, you know, they're not Americans, and so we can treat them like disposable critters. And Trump has a real problem on his hands because, of course, he demonizes the Maduro government. We have applied brutal sanctions to Venezuela, and Venezuelans are leaving. The estimate is that as many as 4 million have now left the country. And many of them are coming to our southern border seeking asylum in the United States. So since he has painted Maduro as an evil dictator, does Trump have any sympathy for Venezuelans who are leaving the country, in large part due to U.S. sanctions? More cruelty. Mexico arrested 2 caravan organizers. The people who defend them say the Mexican government has detained them to present them as trophies before the United States government. And that, sadly, may be true. And here's an account from an American citizen who helps asylum seekers who approach our southern border. And her name is Anna Adlerstein. And she tells the story of how she accompanied several people to the border. It's never gone smoothly. But for the first time in a recent episode, she was arrested and accused of being an immigrant smuggler, simply for advocating for an individual who was requesting asylum. And when you put all this together, I highly recommend an op-ed published in today's New York Times by Suketu Mehta, M-E-H-T-A. And Mr. Mehta is the author of a book, This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. This is a powerful commentary. He says there's a lot of debate these days about whether the U.S. owes its African-American citizens reparations for slavery. It does. But there's a far bigger bill that the U.S. and Europe have run up. What they owe to other countries for their colonial adventures, for the wars they imposed on them, for the inequality they have built into the world order, for the excess carbon they have dumped into the atmosphere. And he proposes immigration as reparations, allowing people to come from the countries we have trashed and live in the United States. Today, 250 million people are migrants. They're moving because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries. Whether it is Iraqis and Syrians fleeing the effects of illegal American wars, or Africans seeking to work for their former European colonial masters, or Guatemalans and Hondurans trying to get into the country that peddles them guns and buys their drugs, they are coming here because we were there. And before you ask them to respect our borders, ask yourself, has the West ever respected anyone's borders? And he says immigration quotas should be based on how much the host country has ruined other countries. Britain should have quotas for Indians and Nigerians, France for Malians and Tunisians, Belgium for the very large numbers of Congolese. So it continues. And I hope you'll read it and share it because I think it's a powerful and important statement, provocative as it is. Well, late yesterday, the prosecutors under a court order released a voicemail message that a lawyer for Michael Flynn received from President Trump's personal lawyer, John Dowd. And Dowd went into kind of the mob zone. And I'm not going to play the voicemail. You may have heard it already. But basically, it's a series of veiled threats, saying that if Flynn is flipped and is working with the government, there could be hell to pay. Flynn did fire his lawyers yesterday, and we still have no resolution about the other part of Judge Sullivan's order, requiring the Justice Department to unredact all references to Mike Flynn in the Mueller report. I expect sparks to fly at some point. We will keep watching for that. Now, speaking of the Mueller report, which I've described as a limited hangout investigation, there's new evidence of just that. Over at the Hill, John Solomon is reporting that hundreds of pages of government documents, which Mueller possessed since 2018, describe Konstantin Kilimnik not as a man with ties to Russian intelligence, which is what Mueller put on page 6 of his report, but as a sensitive intelligence source for the U.S. State Department going back as far as 2013. That's a big difference from making him somehow tied to Russian intelligence. He was a U.S. asset. And I heard Rachel Maddow night after night talking about Kilimnik and that Paul Manafort gave him polling information and now we learn he was one of our guys. And the FBI has done it again. They have entrapped a New York man for alleged attempts at domestic terrorism. And in the Washington Post account, you don't hear about the undercover government agents until the second sentence in this report. Ashakil Alam, a 22-year-old Bangladeshi citizen, lawful permanent U.S. resident from Queens, did not know he was scheming with undercover government agents. Taken into custody after he and one of those agents bought weapons to use in a possible attack. And you know how they arrested him? Because the government sold him weapons that had had their serial numbers removed, making them illegal. This is just another case that sullies the reputation of the FBI, that shows that the so-called war on terrorism is a scam. And again, little, if any, outrage is heard anywhere. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like John Morgan, George Maschke, who lives in The Hague, just renewed his annual subscription. Thank you, George. Judy Holloway, Steve Wazensky, and Carla Mahoney. They all kick in $5 a month, and you can do it too. Just visit peterbcollins.com. Click on the menu, then become a subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and in seconds, you can choose the level of support that's good for you. And if you don't like PayPal and Piero Midyar, I don't blame you. You can just correspond directly with me at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Yesterday in the high seas off the Philippines, a Russian destroyer nearly collided with a U.S. warship. Now, each side is blaming the other for this near miss. They said 50 to 100 feet. And as a sailor, I can tell you if you come that close to another craft, you are near a collision, especially these bigger ships that, don't respond to quick commands to change course. So the Russians say that this was staged by the Pentagon to coincide with a visit to Russia by China's President Xi Jinping. And the U.S. says that the Russian destroyer's crew navigated unsafely, forced the American warship into an avoidance maneuver. And that's not the only near miss. Let's see, on Tuesday, the U.S. Navy's Sixth Fleet said that a Poseidon aircraft was intercepted by a Russian fighter jet 3 times over the Mediterranean Sea. 2 of the intercepts were described as safe, but the third was risky. And I don't know why Russia's doing that. And it's possible the U.S. provokes it. We must be prepared for that possibility. We're now learning that the emergency declared by Trump in order to fast-track the sale of more American arms to replenish the Saudi Arabian armories so they can continue to mow down people in Yemen included a clause allowing Raytheon, a top American defense contractor whose CEO went with Trump on one of his trips to Saudi Arabia. Well, Raytheon has been given permission to team with the Saudis to build high-tech bomb parts in Saudi Arabia, which would allow for the transfer of high-tech precision warfare technology from the U.S. to the Saudis. Just another backdoor, working very effectively. If you haven't heard it yet, I've got a powerful in-depth interview available for subscribers right now at peterbcollins.com with Danny Sershin. Danny is a retired Army major. He taught history at West Point. He knows history. He's a critical thinker. And in his latest published piece at Truthdig today, and I've linked to it in the show file, he takes on the recent news that Trump either has or is expected to issue pardons for people who have been convicted of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Sershin, who served in both of those wars, is livid. This is not only ethically repugnant, he writes, it further sullies what's left of America's reputation abroad and will only increase terrorist recruitment and endanger the U.S. homeland. In one of the cases of Gallagher, the Navy chief stands accused of shooting civilians and murdering a teenage Islamic State captive with his knife and then posing for pictures. And from there, he takes off on Duncan Hunter, the embattled and allegedly corrupt congressman from here in California, who's been bragging about how he killed hundreds of civilians in Fallujah and took pictures of them, too. Couple of stories before I leave you today. NASA has announced that it is commercializing space travel, and it will free up some bunks in the International Space Station for well-heeled travelers who can pay $35,000 a night. That entitles you to air, water, the internet, and a toilet. And I guess you don't need a bunk because you're weightless. You just kind of float around and sleep, right? And, this is some sort of progress. It ties in with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, who want to run trips to outer space. And I'm a little jealous because back in the 70s, I made a reservation to fly to the moon on Pan Am. And then Pan Am went under. And finally today, we bid a fond farewell to Mac Rebennack, better known as Dr. John the Night Tripper. And YouTube won't let me play one of his songs here, but I'm going to link to a whole album that Dr. John recorded after Hurricane Katrina about New Orleans, a city that America forgot. And I got to interview Dr. John a couple of times. It was always by phone. The first time it was in the afternoon. He was so loaded he was incoherent. The second time I said, hey, can we get him in the morning when he's fresh? I talked to him at 11 a.m. New Orleans time, and he was pretty loaded and incoherent. And both times he told me he had just been to the dentist. I'm going to miss you, Dr. John. Hey, thanks for listening to this podcast. Share it as far and wide as you can. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling